Dear students, subscribers and the viewers, welcome to the IAS Mentor. This would be our next lecture in the series Indian Polity. So, we are in lecture number 61 in the series, and this lecture we are going to see another important powers of the President, and not only just the powers of the President, an important provision in the Constitution. And this would be the beginning of this particular power of the President or the provision. That is basically the emergency powers of the President. Very important topic. Every year UPSC does ask one question in the prelims examination. Maybe in the other competitive examination also they might ask such a question. So what does it mean by the emergency powers of the President? If you look into the Constitution of India, there is a specific part in the Constitution wherein from Article 352 to Article 360 of the Constitution, where they deal with what is called as the emergency provisions. And what are the type of emergency powers which is given in the Constitution? So, to be very specific, Article 352 to Article 360 of the Constitution deals with the emergency powers. And if you look into these articles, all these articles has conferred upon the power upon the President of India to exercise his emergency powers. Although the President exercises his powers based on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, so that has to be quite clear that the President does not exercise his power on his own, but based on the aid and advice. But who exercises his power? It is only the President. And what are the powers that is exercised by the President? The three emergency powers that is given in the Constitution, the first type of emergency power is the national emergency, very important power that is conferred upon the President of India. And if you know that since the commencement of the Constitution, how many times this emergency powers has been exercised or this power has been invoked by the President of India, you can put it in the comment box. Not many times this has been exercised, but yes, it has been invoked. And the second type of emergency power is what is called as the state emergency. It is also what is called as a President rule. Either you can call that as a state emergency or the President rule, and which is conferred under Article 356 of the Constitution. The President can declare state emergency in a particular state, and the President can declare national emergency throughout the territory of India or in any part of India under Article 352 of the Constitution. So, how many times? This was my question. So, anyways, I am going to discuss this, but if you know, you can put it in the comment box. And then the third type of emergency is what is called as a financial emergency. If you see the financial emergency, which is given under Article 360 of the Constitution, and you can also put it in the comment box if you know how many times this power has been invoked by the President of India under the Constitution. So, if you know it, you can put it in the comment box, but anyways, I am going to discuss all those things in a little later, but of course, in today's lecture, we will not be able to discuss all the emergency powers. It's very difficult. It's a very big lecture. It will take me 2-3 lectures to complete the entire emergency powers. Now, once I complete the emergency powers, we are done with almost all the powers of the President, almost all the important powers. We already completed the executive powers of the President. We have seen the legislative powers of the President. We have seen the veto powers of the President. We have seen the ordinance making power of the President. We have also seen the pardoning powers of the President. So, now I have taken up the emergency powers. Although provision in the Constitution, these powers are to be exercised by the President. So, I am discussing it here itself. And apart from that, the President also exercises what is called as military powers and diplomatic powers, but that is a very nominal power. It is not a very big power, which I will also discuss. So, once I discuss all these powers, I will also do a practice lecture. That means I will take up some practice questions where I will discuss the questions, and that is going to be very important. As I already said to the students, not just reading will help you to clear the examination, you will have to do sufficient practice. Do the previous year questions, do relevant PYQs, so it will going to help you immensely in building your concepts. Alright. So, with that, the first type of emergency power that I am going to discuss today is the national emergency. But before I get into the national emergency, why do you think such a provision has been given in the Constitution? And what happens whenever any emergency powers are exercised by the President or whenever any emergency is declared in our country? Does the Constitution function in a normal way or does the Constitution goes for a transformation? In fact, keep this as a thumb rule that emergency means it's not a normal situation. And why do we declare an emergency? Emergency means the situation is very difficult. There is a contingent situation which may be because of war, which may be because of any external aggression, or it could be because of some internal reasons, or could be because of external reasons, as already discussed. But the situation is not normal, and hence, if the situation is not normal, the constitution should also transform itself, because otherwise the provisions in the constitution are to deal with our country when there is a situation of normalcy. When there is an abnormal situation, when there is an emergency situation, to deal with that emergency, you will have to go for a different provisions in the constitution. So that is why one thumb rule that you have to keep in your mind is one basic consequence of any type of emergency for that particular matter. Although the degree of change in the constitution can vary, but one thing that in general that you have to keep in your mind is whenever there is an emergency power that is exercised, or when any emergency is declared, the constitution goes for a transformation. The constitution is not as it used to be in the normal circumstances. The constitution transforms itself. And what kind of transformation it goes for? The constitution transforms more into a unitary form of government. Otherwise, you call that India is to be a federal political system. So from a federal political system, it moves towards what is called as a unitary political system. Otherwise, also you can say that India is not a truly federal political system. I do agree with that. I'm not saying that India is truly federal. But as far as the members of the Constituent Assembly are concerned, our Indian Constitution has a federal spirit. There is no doubt. There are a number of provisions in the Constitution that do reflect the federal spirit in the Constitution. But when an emergency is declared, especially a national emergency is declared, the constitution goes for a transformation. It goes more towards an unitary form of government than a federal political system. So how does it change? What are the changes that happens? I will discuss that in the next lecture. But today we will have to understand basically what this national emergency is. What are the circumstances under which the national emergency is proclaimed, and some historical background related to the national emergency. That's a basic understanding we should have. And then what are the consequences of national emergency? I'll do it in the next class. Now, will there be any change in case of state emergency or financial emergency? Does the constitution go for a change? Yes. In case of state emergency and financial emergency also, the constitution does transform itself, but maybe in a lesser degree. So the difference is only in degree, not in the nature. So in all these cases, the constitution will go for a transformation. And how does it go for a transformation? From a federal to a unitary political system. So what I mean when I say an unitary political system, that under the emergency provisions, the power is concentrated in one single authority, that is under national authority or in the hands of the union government. Otherwise, under normal circumstances, this power is divided between the center and the state governments. But during emergencies, who really become powerful, especially during national emergency, all the powers are concentrated in the hands of the national government, that is the union government. And to that extent, the constitution automatically goes for a transformation. Because during war, which is one of the ground on which a national emergency can be declared, you need to control things in one centralized place. And that's the reason the provisions of the constitutions are designed in such a manner by the members of the Constituent Assembly to manage the affairs of the country well in case of what is called as emergency, and to that extent the constitution automatically transforms itself. Alright, so with that basic understanding, now let us get into what is called as the national emergency. Let us try to understand as to what are the various provisions in the constitution related to what is called as the national emergency. So how many times the national emergency has been declared in our country? So far in the history of India, there are 3 occasions on which the national emergency has been declared. So for the first time, the national emergency was invoked under Article 352 of the Constitution in 1962, then in 1971, and the third occasion was in 1975. So in 1962 or 1971, it was because of the external reasons. So what are the external reasons? It is because of war or maybe because of external aggression. So these are the 2 external reasons. So when I say external reasons, that the reason as to why the national emergency is proclaimed has arisen out of the country. So in 1962 it was because of war with China, and 1971 it was because of an external aggression from Pakistan. In both the cases it resulted in war, and therefore there was a national emergency, and these 2 national emergencies were not controversial. But then the third emergency, which was declared in 1975, it was on internal reasons. It was that the reason was within the country, that is internal reason. And what was the reason? It was on the grounds of internal disturbance within the country. So these are the three occasions in which the national emergency has been proclaimed. So the third one was quite controversial. Even today, it remains a controversial thing. So let us have some light on the third national emergency, and I'm not discussing much about the first two national emergency, which was on the grounds of war and external aggression in 1962 and 1971 respectively, because it was not controversial. 1975, the emergency was declared by the Indra Gandhi government, and then President of India was Mr. Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad. So Mr. Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad declared emergency on the advice of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi as per the political historians on 25th June 1975. But to understand this emergency that was declared on the grounds of internal disturbance, which is an internal reason, we'll have to understand as to what happened before this. So when you read the political commentators, so one thing is quite clear, that the national emergency that was declared on 25th June 1975, it had some events that has happened before that. And one important event that has led to the national emergency in 1975 was challenging the election of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi by a person named who is called as Mr. Raj Narayan. Mr. Raj Narayan was the political opponent of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi. So before this 1975 emergency, the elections to the Lok Sabha happened in 1971. 1971 in the Lok Sabha elections, Congress had a huge victory, and the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has also won from a particular constituency, the Raebareli constituency in Uttar Pradesh. So in Uttar Pradesh, when she fought the elections in the Raebareli constituency, her political opponent was Raj Narayan. So Raj Narayan lost the election, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi won the election, and subsequent to that, she also became the Prime Minister. But when she won the election and then become the Prime Minister, even before that she was a Prime Minister, but she was a Prime Minister of a caretaker government. Because you know, just before election, the government is only a caretaker government. But the government does exercise some powers, but it is not a full-fledged government. So the basic contention of Mr. Raj Narayan is that after the election was over, after the result was declared by the Election Commission of India in 1971, and subsequent to that, she also became the Prime Minister, Mr. Raj Narayan has filed a case in the Allahabad High Court. And what did he say? That in the petition that was filed by Raj Narayan categorically said that the election of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi should be declared unconstitutional. The election of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi should be declared to be invalid and illegal. And what is the ground on which he said that it is to be declared to be invalid or illegal? The ground on which she said it should be declared to be invalid or illegal, that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has violated what is called as the Representation of People's Act, RP Act 1951. That the ground on which she has to be declared illegal, and just repeating it again, is that she has used what is called as unconstitutional means, or she has engaged in what is called as various corrupt practices. So in the opinion of Mr. Raj Narayan, he said that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has engaged in what is called as corrupt practices, which means that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has misused her official position in winning the elections. She has misused the government officials, she has misused the government resources in her favor, and that is basically based on which she was able to win the elections, and hence misusing the government resources, government officials for winning the election is a corrupt practice under the Representation of People Act 1951. And Representation of People Act 1951 says, when they are following any corrupt practices, then the election can be declared to be invalid. And hence, Mr. Raj Narayan said that based on these grounds, the election of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has to be declared to be invalid. So, Mr. Raj Narayan has filed a case in the Allahabad High Court. Because to challenge the election to the Member of Parliament, the first level is we will have to go to the respective High Court. On 12th June 1975, a historic judgment was given by the Allahabad High Court. The Allahabad High Court was convinced Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has engaged in what is called as corrupt practice, and therefore her election was declared to be invalid. So this is the incident that has happened before the declaration of emergency. So 12th June 1975, her election was declared to be invalid, and once her election was declared to be invalid, so immediately Prime Minister Indira Gandhi has gone for an appeal in the Supreme Court. So 12th June 1975, the Allahabad High Court declared her election to be invalid. So naturally, you can make an appeal in the Supreme Court against the order of the High Court. So Prime Minister Indra Gandhi has gone for an appeal in the Supreme Court. And on 24th June 1975, an interim order was passed by the Supreme Court. So when I say an interim order is not a final order. It is an interim order. An interim order means that this is an order that is likely to stay till the final decision is given by the Supreme Court. So what is the interim order is saying? The interim order is saying that till the time the Supreme Court finally decides upon this particular matter, she can continue to be the Prime Minister. She can continue to be the Prime Minister and without the right to vote in the Parliament, because unless and until it is clarified whether she is a member of a Parliament, she cannot vote in the Parliament. So till the time she can continue without the right to vote in the Parliament. So till the time we will decide this particular matter, and they allowed Prime Minister to continue in the office of the Prime Minister, but though the matter is still sub judice. So this judgment was given by the Supreme Court on 24th June 1975. After this judgment was given on 24th June 1975, there was a lot of political opposition for Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to continue in the office. Her political opponents said that Prime Minister should step down on moral grounds, and they started a lot of political movements. In fact, a lot of people started marching towards Delhi, and they started to cordon the residence of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. And that is when the advisors of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi advised that this can be seen as an internal disturbance. An internal disturbance is a ground on which we can declare a national emergency. So Prime Minister advised then President of India, Mr. Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, to go for the third national emergency. On the very next day, on 25th June 1975, the national emergency was declared on the grounds of internal disturbance. And what is very important is, now all these things are happening when the matter is already sub judice. But what is very important that you have to notice, when a national emergency is declared under Article 352 of the Constitution, then we should also understand that Article 359. So what is this Article 359? Very quickly. Anyways, I'll discuss that in broad when I take up the next lecture. But whenever a national emergency is declared, is one of the consequences of national emergency is that the enforcement of fundamental rights can be suspended. That means, if the national emergency is declared in our country, then the enforcement of the fundamental rights can be suspended. And under which article it can be suspended? It can be suspended under Article 359 of the Constitution. That means, if any of the individuals' their fundamental rights are violated, they cannot approach the court to enforce their fundamental rights when the national emergency is proclaimed. So what has happened is that there are a lot of people who are protesting against Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. On 25th June 1975, national emergency was proclaimed. And then once a national emergency was proclaimed, she advised the president to suspend the enforcement of various fundamental rights under Article 359. So for which we'll have to understand as to what is this Article 359. So what is Article 359 of the Constitution is saying? Article 359 of the Constitution is saying that if there is a national emergency is a precondition. If there is a national emergency, so once there is a national emergency that is proclaimed, then the president can suspend certain fundamental rights based on the advice, and accordingly those fundamental rights cannot be enforced even if the fundamental rights are violated during the national emergency is in place. So the first thing is the national emergency was proclaimed, and then subsequently the government advised the president to suspend various fundamental rights, enforcement of fundamental rights under Article 359, and therefore the president also suspended some of the fundamental rights like Article 20, Article 21, Article 22 and lot of other fundamental rights. And a lot of people were protesting, because otherwise a peaceful protest is a fundamental right. We know that it's a fundamental right under Article 19, right to association, right to protest, and then you have certain rights under Article 21, right to life and liberty, right against arbitrary detention under Article 22. So these are all some of the fundamental rights under normal circumstances. But during emergency, these rights stand suspended if those rights are suspended by the president under Article 359 of the Constitution, which was suspended. And because it was suspended, a lot of political opponents who are protesting against Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was put behind the bars. So in fact, some of the political commentators also said that the main intention behind declaring this emergency was to take control of the situation, because the situation was going out of control. The protest was going out of control, although it was largely peaceful protest. So there was certain element of criticism. So it is not my personal opinion, but based on various political commentators. So there were certain political commentators who thought that this power was abused by then government to majorly act upon the political opponents of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi. Anyways, so it was constitutionally allowed, it was exercised, and then later it was challenged in the courts and all those things. That's a different matter. So this is the event that has happened before the declaration of national emergency, and after the declaration of national emergency, in one single day, all the political opponents were put behind bars because their fundamental rights stand suspended under Article 359 of the Constitution. So this is the basic understanding you should know. But remember, when all these things are happening, the election of the president, when all these things are happening, the election of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi was still sub judice. It was still pending in the court. In the meantime, a separate development was happening. What was the other development that was happening at that point of time? The other development is a constitutional amendment was introduced in the parliament, and never ever it happened in the history. Within 5 days, a constitutional amendment was passed, and that is the 39th Constitutional Amendment Act. Very, very important. Once it was asked in the prelims examination also. While the matter was pending in the Supreme Court, which is to decide whether the election of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi is valid or not, a simultaneous bill was introduced, a constitutional amendment bill was introduced in the parliament, wherein this amendment declared that if there is any dispute that is arising out of the election of Prime Minister or the election of President or the election of the Speaker in the Houses of the Legislature, then such an election dispute shall be heard only by an authority as may be determined by an act of parliament. That means this constitutional amendment is trying to say that if any election dispute arises out of election of Prime Minister or the President of India or the Speaker in case of Lok Sabha, an election petition can be filed only in front of such an authority, and that authority will be decided by an act of parliament. So right now the matter is pending in the Supreme Court. So once this constitutional amendment is passed, then the Supreme Court will not have the authority to look into this particular matter. And who will have the authority to look into this particular matter? The authority will be decided by an act that will be passed by the parliament. So this amendment has also been passed. And when the amendment was passed, the matter is still pending in the Supreme Court. So by the time the amendment was passed in 1975, the 39th Constitutional Amendment Act. And then the hearing came. When the next hearing came, the Council of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi argued that, my lordship, to the judges of the Supreme Court, that you don't have the authority to look into this particular matter, because as per the Constitution presently, that who has the authority to look into this particular matter? As per the Constitution presently, the authority will be decided by the Parliament, and the Parliament is said to make a law. So the Parliament will make a law, and this matter will be decided by such an authority. So as of now, the Supreme Court has no authority to look into this particular matter. So hence, the Supreme Court cannot deal with this particular matter, and if you pass an order, then that is unconstitutional, because the Constitution does not allow you to deal with this particular matter, because already the 39th Constitutional Amendment Act has been passed. So this argument was put forward by the Prime Minister Council in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court judges was shocked by this particular constitutional amendment. But however, the Supreme Court has declared this constitutional amendment to be unconstitutional. So this is what is very important. The Supreme Court said, okay, this is what the Constitution says, but this is a constitutional amendment. So this constitutional amendment can be challenged in the court of law if that constitutional amendment is violative of what is called as the basic structure of the Constitution. So the Supreme Court categorically said that this 39th Constitutional Amendment Act is taking away the power of the judiciary, and it may be giving in the hands of some other authority based on the law that is made by the Parliament. So therefore, you are taking away the powers of the judiciary and giving it to some other authority. Therefore, you are violating what is called as separation of powers. And the Supreme Court declared that the separation of powers is part of the basic structure. You are not only violating separation of powers, and by this amendment, you are also violating the free and fair elections in our country. While free and fair elections is also part of the basic structure of the Constitution, and therefore your constitutional amendment, that is the 39th Constitutional Amendment Act, is violative of two basic structure. One is separation of powers and free and fair elections, and therefore we are declaring this entire 39th Constitutional Amendment Act to be unconstitutional, and therefore this amendment is invalid in the first place. And because the amendment is unconstitutional and invalid in the first place, we would have the power to look into this particular matter, whether the election of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi is valid or not. However, if the amendment is not invalid, then it will be decided by some other authority as per the constitutional amendment, but the amendment itself is invalid. So we will continue to have this power. So in the Raj Narayan case, two important judgment has come. One is that they have declared 39th Constitutional Amendment Act to be invalid, and they also said that the 39th Constitutional Amendment Act is valid of the basic structure, that is free and fair elections and the separation of powers, so therefore it is invalid. But however, on the other hand, the Supreme Court found the election of Prime Minister Indra Gandhi was not invalid. So the Supreme Court was convinced that the Prime Minister Indra Gandhi has not involved in any corrupt practice, which was contrary to the view that was taken by the Allahabad High Court. So while the election was held to be valid, but the 39th Constitutional Amendment Act was declared to be invalid. So this was the outcome of this particular case. But in the meantime, we have already understood that whenever there is a national emergency, once there is a national emergency, the President can invoke Article 359 and he can suspend various fundamental rights, enforcement of various fundamental rights, and therefore by virtue of Article 359 and the suspension of enforcement of various fundamental rights, a lot of political opponents were put behind the bars. When they were arrested and they were put behind the bars, many of those leaders and many of those people who were arrested by the state authorities, they have challenged such arrest in a court of law. And they said that basically such arrest is violative of their fundamental rights, including Article 21, Article 22 and many of those rights. And all those petitions came in front of the Supreme Court. So they have filed petitions in number of high courts. So different high courts have different judgments. So against all those orders, a petition was filed in the Supreme Court. And that came to be what is called as the ADM Jabalpur case in 1976. And in the ADM Jabalpur case, the Supreme Court made it very clear, when there is a national emergency and the President under the national emergency, if the national emergency is there as a precondition, and subsequent to that, if the President invokes Article 359 and suspends the enforcement of fundamental rights, including the right to life and liberty under Article 21 of the Constitution, the Supreme Court has no authority to protect the right to life and liberty, because the right to life and liberty and their enforcement can be suspended by the President under Article 359. Therefore, under such a circumstances, when there is a national emergency and as a precondition to national emergency, Article 359 is invoked, and if the right to life and liberty is deprived, and even if it is deprived illegally and arbitrarily, so during national emergency, the court is not in a position to give any remedy, because during national emergency, the fundamental rights and their enforcement can be suspended under Article 359. So here in the present case, there is a national emergency, and based on the national emergency, using Article 359, the President has suspended the right to life and liberty. So therefore, we are not in a position to provide any remedy to these people. So this was considered to be a black day in the constitutional history, because if there is a situation where the government arbitrarily exercises its power under Article 352 and arbitrarily suspends the fundamental rights, and then the courts are not in a position to protect the rights of the people, then there is no meaning to a democratic constitution. So therefore, it was considered to be what is called as a black day in our constitutional history. So that is the reason why in 1977, when the emergency came to an end, and then subsequently a new government was formed in 1978, the Janata Party came to power. And in 1978, when the Janata Party, in fact, they came to power in 1977 itself, but in 1978, they made a lot of changes to the constitution, that is the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978, and especially they made a lot of changes to the provisions in the emergency, they made a lot of changes to the emergency provisions in the constitution. So let us try to understand as to what kind of changes, and in fact basically they have made certain changes in the procedures as to how the national emergency can be imposed. So quickly, before I complete this particular lecture, let us try to understand as to what is the procedure to proclaim national emergency, and I am going to discuss the procedure basically as to how it has changed after the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1978. And a lot of other things I will also deal in the other lectures also, but in this lecture I wanted to give certain basic idea. So the next thing is, what is the procedure to proclaim as to what is a national emergency? So the first thing that you have to understand as to what is the procedure to proclaim the national emergency is, it is only the president who can proclaim the national emergency, but the president can proclaim the national emergency only on the written recommendation of the cabinet. That is what is very, very important. So in fact, if you look into the constitution, so whatever I am discussing right now is after the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. So 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978 has made a number of change. So after the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978, it is read in the constitution that the president can declare a national emergency if he is satisfied that if there is an imminent danger to the security of India. So what are the grounds on which there can be danger to the security of India? It can be on the grounds of war, or it can be on the grounds of external aggression, or it can be on the grounds of what is called as armed rebellion. So the key word here that you have to take note is armed rebellion. So what does it mean by armed rebellion? So in fact, before 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978, the word armed rebellion was not there. Instead of the word armed rebellion, there was what is called as internal disturbance. In fact, the third national emergency in 1978 was on the grounds of internal disturbance. But this word internal disturbance was taken away by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, and they brought in the word what is called as armed rebellion. The difference between internal disturbance and armed rebellion is, whereas in case of internal disturbance, there is no need for people to take up any arms. But whereas in case of armed rebellion, if people take up arms and fight against the government, and therefore there is a national security threat, then the president can go for what is called as national emergency. And henceforth, after the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, if at all the national emergency can be proclaimed, it can be on the grounds of war, external aggression, or on the grounds of armed rebellion. So hence, they made sure that in the future, no government can proclaim national emergency on the grounds of internal disturbance, as it was done by the Indra Gandhi government in 1975. And the second important change that they made is, what is the ground on which the national emergency can be proclaimed? Is only if there is a written recommendation that is given by the entire cabinet. So when I say that the written recommendation has to be given by the entire cabinet, that means all the ministers in the government of cabinet rank. Say for example, if you take the government, we generally call them to be council of ministers. But among the council of ministers, the important group of ministers are considered to be what is called as cabinet. And after the cabinet, you have Minister of State, MOS. And then after that, you have what is called as deputy ministers. So while the council of ministers can be categorized into different groups, the most important among them is cabinet ministers. So every government today will have 15 to 20 cabinet ministers. Although the council of ministers can be roughly around 70 to 75 or even more, but the cabinet ministers who are given the cabinet rank, who decides who is to be given the cabinet rank, will be decided by the prime minister. So for example, today Mr. Modi will decide in the present government who are the other ministers who will have cabinet rank. Some of the cabinet ministers today in the present government include Mr. Amit Shah, Mr. Rajnath Singh, Mr. Nitin Gadkari, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman. So these are all some of the cabinet ministers, to name a few. So that means in the future, that is after the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, if at all the emergency is to be declared, proclaimed, national emergency, the president can do, but the president is supposed to do only after all the cabinet ministers give it in writing to the president to declare what is called as national emergency. It cannot be done merely when the prime minister advises. All the cabinet ministers have to give it in writing. Why this change was brought in? Because before 1978, it was done, especially the third national emergency was on the advice of the prime minister alone. So to avoid such arbitrary action, so they made it explicitly in the constitution that the national emergency can be proclaimed only with a written recommendation of all the cabinet ministers. And then the second important change after this that has been made is, now once the written recommendation is given by the cabinet, then the president can proclaim national emergency, and that is not final. Once a national emergency is proclaimed by the president, that has to be approved by the parliament. And within what time it has to be approved by the parliament? It has to be approved by both the houses of the parliament within a period of 1 month. That means it has to be approved within a period of 30 days after the emergency is proclaimed. So what if the houses are not in session when the national emergency is proclaimed? So when the national emergency is proclaimed by the president on the written recommendation of the cabinet, I am saying that is not the final thing. The final authority to approve the national emergency is the president. Sorry, it's the parliament. Until what time the parliament can approve? Within 1 month after the proclamation of national emergency. But if the house is not in session, whenever the house will come to session, so then the house has to approve it. If both the houses are in session at the same time, both the houses have to approve within a period of 1 month. If one house is in session, the other house is not in session, whenever the second house comes to session, within that after the second house comes into session, it has to be approved within a period of 1 month. So this is basically what you'll have to understand. So whenever the house will come to session, it has to be approved within a period of what is called as 1 month. Now before the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, the time that was given for this approval is 2 months. But today the time that is given is only 1 month. And what does it mean by this approval? The approval means that both the houses of the parliament has to pass this with a resolution, with a specific majority. And what is that majority? I will discuss it. So with certain majority, they have to vote, yes, the emergency can continue. We are okay for the proclamation of emergency, and that is what is the approval that is given by both the houses of the parliament, which they have to do it within a period of 1 month. That is what basically we have to understand. And once it is approved by the parliament, how long it can extend? It can extend for a period of 6 months from the day of proclamation by the president. So once a president proclaims and the parliament approves, from the date of proclamation by the president, it can continue for a period of 6 months. After 6 months, can the proclamation continue? Yes, it can continue, provided again it is approved by the parliament. That is, again it is approved by both the houses of the parliament. If the parliament again approves it, again it can continue for another 6 months. That means at the time, the national emergency can continue only for a period of 6 months. Or in other words, for every 6 months, for the continuation of national emergency, it requires approval of the parliament. See, the president will proclaim the emergency only once, but it can be extended indefinitely by the parliament. So, who is authority to extend the national emergency once it is proclaimed by the president? It is only the parliament. Every time the parliament approves, the emergency can continue for another 6 months. And then again approve, it can continue for another 6 months. In this way, how long it can be extended? It can be extended for an indefinite period. And every time the parliament gives approval, parliament means both the houses of the parliament, they need to give the approval by what is called as special majority. And what is a special majority? So special majority shall satisfy two conditions. What are those two conditions? Not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting, and it should also satisfy the absolute majority of the house. So that means the number of people who are supporting the extension and continuation of emergency should satisfy absolute majority and also not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting. If you want to have an understanding of what is absolute majority and not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting, and in general what is special majority, I have made a separate lecture on the majorities in the parliament. In the initial lectures, you can go and refer to the types of majorities. You will have a proper understanding. But every time the parliament gives approval, it has to be by a special majority. In fact, the special majority in the original constitution was not special majority. In the original constitution, it was simple majority. But the simple majority was replaced by special majority by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act. Alright, so this is how the proclamation can be. This is how the procedure to proclaim a national emergency. I am just repeating it. What is the procedure to proclaim a national emergency? So, presently after the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, if at all the national emergency is to be proclaimed, who can do that? The president can do that. What is the ground on which he can do that? 3 grounds: war, external aggression and armed rebellion. But how and when he can do that? Only after written recommendation is given by the cabinet. When I say written recommendation by the cabinet, all the ministers of cabinet rank should give it in writing. And then the president can proclaim the emergency. But is it a final thing? No. Once the emergency is proclaimed, it has to be placed for the approval of the parliament, where both the houses of the parliament has to give the approval with special majority within a period of 1 month. But if during the proclamation of emergency, if the parliament is not in session, whenever they come to session or whenever the second house comes to session, within 1 month they have to give the approval. In the meantime, the first house should give the approval, and when the second house comes into session, it should also give the approval within a period of 1 month. And then once the approval is given, it can continue for 6 months from the day of proclamation by the president. And after 6 months, can it continue? Yes. Again, if the parliament gives approval by special majority, then it can continue for another 6 months. So in this way, every 6 months, the proclamation can be extended. Every 6 months, a national emergency can be extended, and it can be extended for an indefinite period of time. But it has to be given approval by special majority. Now, if the emergency is to be brought to an end, what is the way by which it can be brought to an end? A national emergency can be revoked by the President of India anytime. Anytime the President can pass an order, say that I am bringing an emergency to an end. Again, not a discretionary power of the President, but this is to be exercised based on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So, if the Council of Ministers advise, the President can say that I am revoking this particular national emergency. That's one way of bringing an emergency to an end. There is an alternative route by which the national emergency can be brought to an end. The alternative route was brought in by what is called as the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act. So today there are two ways by which a national emergency can be brought to an end. One way is the President can revoke it at any time, which was there in the original constitution also. But there is an alternative route that was added by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act apart from the President revoking the national emergency anytime is, suppose if the President is not revoking the national emergency, alternatively what is the route? The members of the Lok Sabha can pass a resolution. And what is that resolution? That resolution is saying that the emergency should be brought to an end. That means a proposal has to be introduced in the Lok Sabha, only in the Lok Sabha. The Rajya Sabha has no role in that. Only in the Lok Sabha, a proposal has to be introduced saying that the emergency should be brought to an end. And if this proposal is passed by a simple majority in the Lok Sabha, then this resolution is binding upon the President. While the first route, when the President revokes a national emergency, is based on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. The second route alternative is, if the President is not doing that or the Council of Ministers is not advising that, but if the members of the Lok Sabha feel that there is no need to continue with the emergency, then they can pass a resolution to bring down this national emergency. And if a resolution is passed by a simple majority, this resolution is binding upon the President. Therefore, the President can also bring or revoke the national emergency. These are the two ways by which the national emergency can be brought to an end. But the alternative route was added only by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act. Now, try to understand that various new provisions has been brought in by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act. They all aimed at preventing the misuse of this emergency powers by the government in the future because of their experience in the third national emergency in 1975. So, I would say this to be a very, very important topic. We have understood a number of important things. Please do watch this lecture in total to get full clarity on the national emergency. But the topic of national emergency is not yet over. One important thing that I will discuss in the next lecture is what are the consequences of national emergency, but I will do it in the next lecture. But in this lecture, you would have got a broader idea. So, basically as to what is the emergency provisions, how or what is the rationality why the constitution goes for a transformation when there are emergencies, and then specifically what is the historical background behind the national emergency, especially the third national emergency. What is the background of 39th Constitutional Amendment Act, why the 39th Constitutional Amendment Act was struck down, what is Article 359, and of course what is the procedure to proclaim national emergency, what are the changes that has happened to the procedure post the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act. You can expect a question from this particular area, although the topic is not yet complete, whereas we will have to see the consequences of national emergency, which I will do it in the next class. But before I complete this particular lecture, so please have a look into this particular question, and then we will continue with this particular topic in the next class. So, have a look into the question. So, try to solve this question. The national emergency under the Constitution of India can be extended 6 months, 3 years, indefinitely, provided the Parliament approves it every 6 months, none of the above. So, please put your answers in the comment box. And if you have any questions related to this particular lecture, you can reach out to me through my Instagram account or through my Telegram account. Not only related to this particular lecture, but related to the series or in general related to your preparation to civil service or other competitive examination, you can reach out to me through this Instagram or Telegram account. And if you like this video, please share it with your friends, and I am very sure that it is going to be immensely beneficial for the students preparing for various competitive examinations. Alright, so before I wind up, I will also put one more question, and if you know the answer, you can put it how many times so far the state emergency has been invoked. If If not the exact number, at least the rough number you can put it if you know it in the comment box. Otherwise, I'll discuss it in the next lecture. Alright. So with that, I'll wind up the lecture for today. Thank you very much for watching this particular lecture. All the very best.